Good afternoon. My name is Matt Howard. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Virtru. I am joined by my colleague, Nikita Shenoy, here today. Nikita, thanks for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So wanted to have a quick catch up with you. I know you spend a lot of time talking to a lot of, major universities doing research on behalf of the federal government and, having to find ways to kind of deal with like tight budgets and still comply with, pretty significant security requirements as it relates to like classified data. Last week, there was an article, I saw it, I think you saw it as well, where the federal government is suing Penn State University with respect to the, their apparent lack of compliance with the government regulations, but not just lack of compliance. They allegedly claimed that they were complying only to be sort of disclosed that they weren't. Curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, it's, surprising and not surprising, right? I think surprising in that, you're hearing about this happening with a public institution, one that is, pretty famous for the research data it does, with R1 universities having a lot of the most strict data requirements related to federal government, but also not surprising in that, I think talking with universities on a daily basis, I understand how strapped they are for resources and a lot of the times needing to cut corners in the way that they, handle sensitive data and handle their limited budgets and limited resources in terms of staffing and faculty. And I think this is just one of those instances in which I think faculty, staff probably thought they were doing the right things, but unfortunately they had to cut some corners and ultimately are now being sued because of it.
Interesting. So I mean, I think that's an important point. I mean, clearly R1 universities in this country doing research on behalf of the federal government, they don't get there overnight. They've done an amazing amount of work over decades, sometimes 100 years or more, just as leading research organizations. But so much of what they do is really sensitive stuff. And the government takes pretty seriously the requirements as it pertains to things like CMMC, and how do you put policies around CUI to govern sensitive data that's moving in and out of the research university, ultimately, on behalf of the customer, the federal government, and the policies and the process and the governance that the universities put into place. I guess it has to be good enough to meet the government's requirement, but it also has to be affordable enough to sort of fit within the government's, rather the school's budget. Is that kind of the way you see it?
Definitely. Yeah. I think a lot of these universities tend to have this reliance on the tools that they're just using on a day-to-day basis. I think in this case was Microsoft, right? Penn State moved off of Box because just using inherent Microsoft tools was cheaper for them. And they sort of trusted that they were getting, the right security in place to be able to do the day-to-day jobs. But that obviously wasn't the case. And I think, it comes down to overly trusting single source providers. It comes down to trying to make the dollar stretch the furthest. And then sometimes it just comes down to, on people that are just trying to learn things on the fly, right? Trying to understand how do we now protect CUI? How do we protect sensitive data related to the government kind of on the fly?
Yeah, and I certainly am sympathetic and empathetic, I know you are as well, as to how hard it is to do cybersecurity well in any organization, especially maybe a university that has these particularly constrained IT budgets. But then again, the more I read about this, the more I learn about this particular situation. My understanding, it wasn't sort of just like a simple, like, we thought we were covered, mea culpa apology. Apparently, after some internal risk assessments were done, in order to kind of make it look like they were complying, at least the former CIO, who's, the suit is being brought on behalf of, alleges that some people in the school were basically uploading files to kind of like effectively fake files to make it look like they were compliant, which just seems like, I don't know, that just seems kind of like a stretch of that's trying to check a compliance box the wrong way, is I guess the best way to put it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I do wonder, I think in these large institutions, you have so many layers of IT people, right? It's like, does one hand know what the other hand is doing type of situation. I think, especially since the whistleblower in this case was the CIO, I almost wonder who signed off on this, right? who was the one who was sort of assigned this project and hey, we need to, get CUI protected and sort of decided this was the right decision for them, and why was it not uncovered sooner?
Yeah. And, so shifting gears, like as a taxpayer in this country and looking at the world that we all live in, the cyber risk landscape is kind of a scary place. And the type of research that these R1 universities are doing are really important to, our country's present and our country's future. And it's, these NIST standards, exist for a reason. I'm specifically talking about 800-171 and these compliance regimes, that the federal government has with respect to these research universities doing work on behalf of the federal government. They exist for a reason. It's, I always imagine that if someone wasn't quite doing right by the compliance regime, that they might somehow get maybe a slap on the wrist or something like that. But again, as a taxpayer, when I saw this news, I was a little surprised to see that the federal government's bringing a lawsuit. I mean, this is indicative of the fact that they take this really seriously. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. As they should. Right. But my mind sort of went to, because, I think CUI for me as a salesperson at Virtru is a little less, something that I touch on a daily basis, other than the fact that I work with many, many institutions that have to deal with it. But, from my perspective as, someone who goes to, or was, at Maryland, where, a lot of my Social Security records might be, or, health records may have been in the past. I wonder if this is happening with some of the most regulated data that's related to our federal government. I wonder, is this happening with HIPAA data? Is it happening with FERPA data, with PCI? Other?
How many times are other organizations struggling to comply with strict data regimes, kind of faking it, so to speak?
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know, but couple thoughts on that front. Here's one. If they are, it's likely that they will be held accountable in the future if they're caught. I mean, this I believe is the first time that the federal government is actually suing an organization for this type of behavior, but it won't be the last, because they've apparently stood up a new compliance authority and are intending to kind of take compliance to the next level, just to make sure that the people that are doing research on behalf of the federal government in all of these R1 universities are in fact taking those data security requirements seriously and not quote unquote faking it until they make it, so to speak.
Yep. Yeah, I'm curious, do you think that more whistleblowers will come out in the future, for other, not only universities, but other organizations that need to meet CMMC, ITAR?
It's hard to say. I mean, one thing I do know is the cyber game is hard, and it's hard for the best organizations in the world that have the biggest budgets with the most talent and, all the resources in the world, can still leave you in a situation where you're making mistakes with respect to cybersecurity and data security governance. I mean, case in point, Microsoft recently with the State Department. So no one is pretending this is easy. To answer your question specifically, I sure hope not. I mean, my view is actually that the vast majority of the defense industrial base in this country does their absolute best to do the right thing and sort of implement cybersecurity hygiene and compliance with the government regulations. I suppose in this case, it's a little surprising to see, an organization like Penn State kind of do the opposite, or at least that's what's been alleged. It'll be fascinating to see where this case goes and see what comes out. We don't have all the details yet, but it'll be fascinating to see what we learn from here. And the last thing I would say, and curious to get your thoughts, I imagine this definitely shines a light on R1 universities trying to up their game with respect to data security and compliance based on this latest development.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I mean, just speaking to my customers, I've seen a huge push in the last 6 months, trying to get solutions in place that enable them to comply, but also communicate this sensitive data in the way that it needs to be shared. I just hope that they have the resources to be able to do those types of things. But yeah, I mean, I can definitely see if people weren't placing importance on it before, that especially after this, they definitely will.
And on that point, this obviously this is just me and you chatting about a recent news event, which is sort of relevant, I think, to the broader industry. But as someone who spends a lot of time with universities, working with them to kind of implement Virtu's data-centric security products, you've mentioned a couple times this concept of budget constraints and resources. How would you view Virtu in your role, and are you able to generally find, sounds like you are, but what's it like to kind of go in there, find a sponsor for your product, and then have the budget conversation? I mean, you can't be the most expensive tool in the world because they don't have all the dollars in the world. So how does that work?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think that the main thing I try and tell my customers is Virtu's not a silver bullet. We're not going to meet every control that's required by NIST, right? We're a small but a very important piece of the puzzle, and one that can be deployed very easily and seamlessly within existing workflows. One of the things I often hear is how difficult it is to get researchers trained up on a certain tool, or they have to work in this certain secure enclave, which is very hard to implement new tools into. The way that we use our tool every day, it's just built into existing workflows. So it's a lot easier to do that for a lot of these universities. So not only just from a cost perspective, it's also from a resource perspective, like needing to train up these people who have other things to do. It's much more simple, but again, it's not the entire piece of the puzzle. It's just one small important part of it.
Yeah, unstructured data is hard, especially as it's flowing, sensitive unstructured data flowing in and out of a big university, and putting governance and policy control around it's really hard. Yep. It has to be affordable, to your point, and fit within the budget. The other thing it has to do is be easy enough for people to actually use, so the policy and the governance gets applied, and then compliance is something that ultimately flows from there. But it's a good story. I know that you've been able to tell successfully, as you have done some really great work with a number of large R1 universities across the country. And seeing this in the news last week, it just made me want to reach out, connect, and compare notes with you for a few minutes, because I hadn't seen anything like this before, and I really thought it was interesting, and certainly will be curious to see how this plays out in the public eye in the coming weeks and months. But thanks very much for taking the time to be here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate being on, and definitely we'll keep you in the loop as we hear more.
Yeah, let's circle back and maybe do this again in a couple of months once we have a fuller picture. Thanks.